As surely all of you know, the year 2023 witnessed the publication of the Battle of Maldon together with the Homecoming of Beornoth by J.R.R. Tolkien, edited by Peter Gribauskas. In his recent review of that book, Josh Old has stated that if you want to step into the mind of Tolkien the academic, the Battle of Maldon is exactly how you do that. And that is exactly what we are going to do this evening. We are going to explore the mind of Tolkien the academic by discussing his views on that poem in particular, the Battle of Maldon, and on Old English poetry in general, as they are contained in Gribauskas' book. The volume consists of 3 main parts and 6 appendices. Part 1 includes a historical note by Tolkien on Beornoth's death, the Homecoming of Beorhelm's son, which is Tolkien's play in alliterative verse about the aftermath of the Battle of Maldon, his essay Overmod, very famous essay, and a series of explanatory notes by Gribauskas. Part 2 contains Tolkien's introductory note on the Battle of Maldon, his prose translation of that poem, and a selection of notes on various aspects and classes of the text. Part 3 is Tolkien's lecture on the tradition of versification in Old English, as the subtitle indicates, with special reference to the Battle of Maldon and its alliteration, and my favorite part in the book. And the 6 appendices are Old English prosody, the tradition of versification continued, alliteration on G in the Battle of Maldon, an early homecoming in rhyme, noteworthy developments in the drafts of the Homecoming, and proof in the pudding, the Homecoming in dialogue with the Legendarium. My paper today will focus on parts 2 and 3, along with appendices 1 and 3, both because they are of particular interest to medievalists and because they had never been published before. More specifically, my paper will be divided into 2 halves. In the first half, I will discuss Tolkien's prose translation of the Battle of Maldon and the textual commentary accompanying it. This discussion of the translation and the commentary will provide the context for the second half of my paper, in which I will assess Tolkien's views on Old English meter as they are expressed in Part 3 and appendices 1-3 of the book. The reason why meter and Tolkien's views on meter are important and significant is that meter often serves as the only source of insights into an area that would otherwise remain completely mysterious and impenetrable, namely Old English literary history. And the reason why this is so is that Old English poetry famously survives in copies that were made long after the poems were composed. And that is why literary history in Old English is highly contentious. And that is where meter comes in. As we will see, Tolkien had highly sophisticated views on the subject, and in several ways, he anticipated debates that have recently taken place in the scholarly field of Old English metrics and literary history. Tolkien's translation of the Battle of Maldon was produced, according to Gribauskas, sometime in the mid to late 1920s, and a partly obliterated note pencil by Tolkien at the top left of the first page of the translation reads, "This affair intended attempt to reproduce the poetic effect of the original," which of course would seem to mean the aim of the translation is to reproduce the effect of the original. But the editor, Gribauskas, believes that the missing words would reverse the meaning of the note, since the translation is in prose and more concerned with conveying the meaning of the original than with its poetic effect. Gribauskas' assumption received support from Tolkien's prefatory remarks to C.L. Wren's revision of Clark Hall's translation of Beowulf, where he said, "To use a prose translation for this purpose is nonetheless an abuse. Beowulf is not merely in verse, it is a great poem, and the plain fact that no attempt can be made to represent its meter, while little of its other specific poetic qualities can be caught in such a medium, should be enough to show that Clark Hall, revised or unrevised, is not offered as a means of judging the original or as a substitute for reading the poem itself. The proper use of a prose translation is to provide an aid to study, which is an interesting quote, though maybe not the best quote to introduce the prose translation of Clark Hall. There is little doubt that Tolkien thought of the Battle of Maldon as a great poem, and so it makes sense to assume that he saw his prose translation as an aid to its study. Tolkien's text, Tolkien's translation, is easy to read and not marked by archaisms, except for maybe God alone knoweth, which translates the proverbial God are a word of Old English. It is also quite close to the original, though he does not hesitate to provide less literal renderings every now and then, if these are deemed useful for clarification. Lines 17-19 of the poem, for example, are translated as follows. Fathar buchnothum gan, beorna strimian, rad and radde, ringum tachte, who schulden standen and von stere heldan. And Tolkien's translation. There then Buchnoth began to dispose his men and rode from point to point, giving advice to and orders how they should place themselves and hold that position. The addition of from point to point, which is not in the original, helps the reader to visualize the scene in greater detail. Similar additions are keen in lines 12 and 13, in the front rank, in line 16, and again in line 40-41. A more periphrastic or interpretive approach is adopted, for example, with Het thabord beran, beornas gangan, and Tolong hit him thuchte, which are translated as, he then gave orders to advance the ranks and for the men to march forwards, and they were impatient, compare Ashdown's. He bade the warriors advance, bearing their shields, and all too long it seemed, which are more literal. I can see the text, Tolkien's translation, being fruitfully used in class. An interesting exercise, I think, for prelims would be to read the original poem alongside Tolkien's version and Ashdown's more literal rendering. Tolkien's translation of lines 84-90, a key passage for the overall interpretation of the poem, deserves special mention. Let's see the text and the translation. Tha hietharon jeaton, and jerne jesawon, that hiethar breach weerdas, bitere fundun, ongunnon lytegien tha, lade gistas, badon that he upgangan, agan morstun, over thone fort faran, fedan laden. Tha seerongan, for his overmode, al even landes to fella lade ferde, which Tolkien translates. When they perceived this and saw clearly that they had come there upon no gentle guardians of the bridge, those vile invaders made a plausible appeal to Birnoth's chivalry and asked they might have opportunity for coming up on his bank and leading their troops over the fort. Then the Earl, in his overconfident chivalry, conceded too much land to that hateful people. As can be seen, an understatement, no gentle guardians of the bridge, is used to translate bridge weerdas bitere, literally bitter bridge guardians. Tolkien's translation choice emphasizes the Vikings' reversal of expectations upon encountering Gulfstan, Algere and Maccus on the causeway, and so aligns them more closely with Grendel in Beowulf. He's more a claw at first in the set text, and then he arrives in Huron and expectations are reversed. So I can see Tolkien here making Maldon, through the translation, closer to Beowulf in a way. Even more remarkable is Tolkien's rendering of the phrase ongunnon lytegian, which is normally rendered as used guile or similar, as made a plausible appeal with Birknoth's chivalry added in parentheses. The idea, of course, is that the Vikings are taking advantage of Birknoth's deep sense of honor, which they seem to know well. In keeping with this translation, he then glosses Overmod as overconfident chivalry. Gribauskas believes that the use of this jarringly anachronistic term perhaps called attention to Birknoth's mistaken judgment in granting the Vikings their request. I think that it is possible to see it instead as an instance of so-called domestication in translation studies. The best way for Tolkien's readers to understand the character of Birknoth was to think of him as a late medieval knight, a figure that on account of his popularity would have been more familiar to them than that of an earl from late Anglo-Saxon England. A similar strategy can be seen in Tolkien's translation of Beowulf, in which Old English words for warrior are often translated by terms associated with chivalric romance and Arthurian legend, like Duguthe and Yuguthe, which is given in Tolkien's translation as both knights and young. The underlying assumption is that Germanic heroic legend was for Old English audiences equivalent to what Arthurian romance is for contemporary ones. In fact, Tolkien referred to the Beowulf poet as the Mallory of the Heorot legends. Very beautiful way of putting it, I find. The series of notes on the poem by Tolkien bears witness to his extensive expertise in Old English language and literature, and we are going to see a few of such notes, or such ideas. He accounts, for example, for the expression on Hirasilvra Dom, in line 38b of the poem, as bearing on the characterization of the Vikings as a tyrannically greedy people. In order to show that the adjective ealde, old, is a compliment when applied to swords, a parallel is established with the eald sveord eotonish, with which Beowulf kills Grendel's mother. As Tolkien puts it, battles are won by old swords. And I think we can see the same idea in The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and whatnot. Use of the adjective cold, in line 91b of the Battle of Maldon, Tolkien explains, is particularly meaningful because it refers literally to the temperature of the water and metaphorically to the fateful crossing that resulted in disastrous defeat for the English. He then adds that Old English verse use of words is full of subtleties of this sort for those who will observe. A beautiful remark by Tolkien, I find, about Old English poetry, and a very inspiring one. The word brun, which normally means brown, in the compound brun-edge, in the Battle of Maldon, does not mean, Tolkien says, brown or dark in that poem, but white gleaming, because Tolkien says that is its meaning in Germanic poetic tradition, which includes Judith, Beowulf, and even the Chanson de Roland. The compound Schildburg, cognate with Old Norse Skjaldborg and Old High German Schildburg, corresponding to the Latin gloss testudo, refers to an intimidating array of soldiers standing very closely to each other with shield touching shield, as described in Harald's saga Sigurdarsonar, in connection with the Battle of Stamford Bridge. That Eadward Selanga, in the poem, managed to break into such an impressive defense formation was thus a most astonishing feat. So what we see Tolkien doing in the commentary to the translation is to use language to explain what is going on in the poem in literary terms. Very artful use of language and literature, I'd say, is what we see. Tolkien thought that for all of the poem's traditional style and diction, like his remarks on the author's use of poetical haleth, for example. Oh, sure. Sure. So this is a new idea, or an idea that there is in the commentary as well, and I think that can be connected to Tolkien's views on religion, maybe. I would be interested to know what you think in the Q&A. So Tolkien thought that the account given of the poem, of the battle in the poem, is close to historical fact. Thus, he believes that there is no reason to doubt that Wulfmar was really Birknoth's Sustersunu, even though the relationship between nephew and maternal uncle was a prominent one in Germanic heroic tradition. For example, Fitela and Sigemund in Beowulf, or Hildeburh's son and Hnaf in Finnsburg. He argues that actual events should not be dismissed as fabrications, just because they happen to coincide with recurring motifs of legendary traditions. As he puts it, things do not become legendary unless they are common and poignant human experiences first. And this is what I find the notion very interesting, and that maybe could be connected to his views about religion and how, I suppose he would say the same about how Christianity started. Like, you need something important first. You cannot fabricate something that easily. It seems to me that that notion is guiding his scholarship here. Similarly, he thinks that there is no need to suspect that Berchtold was not an alienated, and that the words that he spoke were very dissimilar from the ones found in the poem. As he says, the old retainer is, in literary tradition, more protective of the honor of his house than even the master is. And the reason is that was the state of affairs in real life. So literature is a reflection of real life. And so it has to be judged that way. Tolkien's reasoning here is more or less the same that made him identify the hengest of the Finnsburg fragment, an episode with Horsa's namesake brother, in historiographical tradition. You know how in Anglo-Saxon studies it is often said, no, Hengest and Horsa, that must be pure legend, because they are literary characters. And I think I sympathize with Tolkien's views here. When I discuss this with my friends, I often say, I have a friend, my name is Rafael, which is the name of an archangel. I have a friend called Miguel, and we often go hiking, and we go to the Mulhacén, which is the highest mountain in Spain, very, very, very high. And I suppose that if these were recorded and reported many centuries after we did it, people would think that it's a fabrication. Like, what a coincidence, two guys with the name of archangels going to the top of the mountain? That must be a lie. Well, no, it happened. Sorry, very, very silly idea. Tolkien takes Turmere in line 249a to be a reference to Sturmer in Essex, and he regards it as a grain of evidence in support of the East Saxon origin of the poem. Tolkien's argumentation here is reminiscent of scholarly attempts to identify the origin of medieval works such as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and the Cantar de Miofid on the basis of the author's topographical knowledge. In connection with line 286a, Offa Thonesalidan. Offa killed that Viking. Tolkien wonders which of the Vikings was slain by Offa, and suggests that the killer of Birnoth might have been the one intended. He was right to wonder which among the multitude of Vikings is being referred to, since the linguistic context is one of definiteness, Thonesalidan, that Viking, unambiguously indicated by the demonstrative. As Mark Griffith has demonstrated, however, the reference is not to the killer of Birnoth, as Tolkien thought, but to the notorious messenger who defiantly tried to blackmail him at the beginning of the poem. And let me know what you think, but I always thought that the messenger of the Vikings at the beginning of the Battle of Maldon is the source for the mouth of Sauron. No, same kind of approach, same kind of character. Anyway, we now move to the second part of the paper about meter, prosody. Eric Stanley, in his memoir about Lewis and Tolkien, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, as I knew them, never well, published in the Journal of Indian Studies. And if I'm correct, Mark, this is the journal where your review of,
That's right, yeah.
of both Tolkien's Maldon and Mark Griffith's Maldon,
Yes.
which I have now read, I've read in advance, and I can only recommend it because it's a very inspiring review and made me feel really enthused about Old English. So Eric Stanley, in that memoir that he published, recalls having regularly attended Tolkien's weekly seminars at Merton, and he remembers Tolkien's deep interest in meter. And now I will read the anecdote to you. I really love this anecdote. Tolkien was usually very patient, very encouraging, very polite, very friendly, except when some fundamental philological mistake had, in his eyes, ruined some student's paper. I sympathize completely. One of our number, fortunately not me, did not distinguish an Old English Greek verb of class 1 with medial R, resulting in the retention of unsyllabic I, as we all know. Like Hereyan, if an Old English student sometimes pronounces that word as Herian rather than Herian. So, resulting in the retention of an syllabic I, Herian, for example, from a weak verb of class 2, Luvian, not Luvian. Metrically, it makes a great deal of difference. Tolkien was interested in meter and prose rhythm, as well as in meaning. When that fundamental error was uttered by a student, Tolkien was sharp, no longer friendly, and said he wished to hear no more of the paper. Tolkien treated philology not as an entity in itself, but as the handmaid of literature. I always found that a very beautiful way of putting it, and it seems to me that in a way that is the spirit of course too. Part 3 of the Battle of Maldon book and appendices 1-3 testify to Stanley's recollection of Tolkien as someone interested in meter. In the lecture on the tradition of versification in Old English, Tolkien advances the important argument that metrico-stylistic differences or divergences between Beowulf and the Battle of Maldon are not to be attributed in the main to the passing of time or to the later poet's inferior skill, as has been and is still often done, but to an essential difference in mode of composition. Beowulf, Tolkien argues, is in the compact epic manner, scholarly and written style, whose meter has been polished, even down to the smallest detail, in a laborious and consciously artistic way. The Battle of Maldon, on the other hand, is in a freer, less compacted mode that was only rarely committed to writing, and which was used, and I quote, to celebrate events while the news of them was still hot. That chronology is not as important as mode of composition to account for differences between Beowulf and Maldon is shown by the fact, Tolkien argues, that The Death of Edward, a poem composed 70 years or more after the Battle of Maldon, is in the same compact style as Beowulf. Tolkien's view that Anglo-Saxon poetic culture was metrically and stylistically more diverse than the written records suggest is very, very interesting and closely parallels scholarly consensus about the dialectal situation in the Old English period. Tolkien's influence can, I think, be detected behind such classics of medieval English scholarship as Dorothy Everett's Lagamon and the earliest Middle English alliterative verse, and Alistair Campbell's The Old English Epic Style, one of my favorite essays ever. Tolkien's argument is a sophisticated one, and the possible role of chronology in the development of a looser mode of composition is given serious consideration. As the syntax of Old English became more analytical, and as there was a consequent increase in the number of elongated phrases, for example, mid prasse vestoron, as opposed to earlier prasse vestoron without the preposition, poets may have felt the need to create a different but related meter that was more tolerant of anacrusis in the second half of the line, and which was therefore more suitable for rapid composition. This freer style, however, might have begun to emerge relatively early in the period, as elongated phrases always existed in the language. The old compact style, moreover, would have remained intact and available for later poets, as attested, for example, in The Death of Edward, mentioned before. Even though, of course, long compositions in it would have been linguistically more challenging than at earlier times. The development of the freer style in Old English is compared to that of Maulahauter in Old Norse, and the Battle of Maldon, a poem with close stylistic affinities to both earlier Old English and Middle English alliterative verse, is said to be analogous to Atlaquida, whose meter is intermediate between the older Fornyrdislag and the more recent Maulahauter. Tolkien, in fact, often relies throughout the essay on his knowledge of Old Norse in order to shed light upon the poetic culture of Anglo-Saxon England, as when he explains how the rules of meter would have been acquired by Old English poets by reference to Icelandic sources. a considerable amount of space and effort in the lecture is devoted to disproving the widespread belief that metrical change results inevitably and straightforwardly from linguistic change. And here I think Tolkien was interestingly anticipating later scholarship, especially American scholarship, where I think the connection between metrical change and linguistic change is often thought to be unmediated. Language change takes place, the key thing for Tolkien is the following. Language change takes place beyond the consciousness of speakers, but meter is an abstract and artistic pattern consciously imposed upon language. And so, even though linguistic change will of course put pressure on metrical structure, the integrity of this can be, and in fact was preserved, by the poet's deliberate, conscious determination. They were aware of meter in a way that they could not be aware of language, so to speak. At least 3 parallels are used to illustrate this notion. Those of the man tying his necktie, the woodman weaving a garland, and the recipe as an entity independent of the pudding. This method of exposition will be familiar to readers of Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, where Tolkien famously used the allegory of the tower to exemplify the chasm between the artistry of the Old English poem on the one hand and its inadequate critical reception on the other. That meter is not wholly dependent on phonetics means that the metrical rules are not fundamentally altered by the passing of time, as is often believed. Instead, the abstract metrical pattern handed down by tradition is allowed to be occupied by linguistic material in ways that are new and would have displeased earlier poets. For example, the adverbial suffix liche in Beowulf 2899a, ab he soth liche. There, the adverbial liche occupies 2 metrical positions with half stress or tertiary stress on li. In the Battle of Maldon, on the other hand, owing to the progressive weakening of tertiary stress, adverbial liche is allowed to occupy just a single position and is unstressed, as in stilice clipode. So for both poets, stilice clipode would have been unmetrical to the Beowulf poet. But for both poets, the metrical pattern remains the same. So language changes and language has to be adapted to the metrical pattern. But meter can be preserved from change in a conscious way by poets. That's the big idea contributed by Tolkien, and one that is not maintained in much, or not held in much of modern scholarship on metrics. Okay, so it should be noted at this point that a number of scansions in Tolkien's piece will fail to command the assent of metrics. So there are a number of errors made by Tolkien. Line 177b, Scythian mote, is analyzed by Tolkien as an instance of Siversian type A2A, with a half stress for an unstressed drop in second position. So the reasoning behind this analysis is that in line 251b, Ham Scythia can only, like this verse can only scan as a type D, with metrical stress on the. And so the should be identically scanned in line 177b. Tolkien's interpretation is unsurprising, since it was made at a time when the metrical behavior of words like Scythian had not yet been fully explained. As R.B. Folk discovered in 1992, however, trisyllabic non-compounds with short medial syllables like Scythia, Scythian, evince an ambivalent behavior in poetry. Placed at the end of the verse, their medial syllables receive a half stress, but if placed at the beginning, the medial syllables are then metrically unstressed. So the idea here is that Tolkien thought, because Scythia has to be stressed here, it should always be stressed. But that is not the case. It was discovered later on that there are good reasons to believe that certain words can be metrically ambiguous. And so Tolkien made that mistake. Tolkien made a number of other mistakes, and I suppose we could give him a bit of his own medicine and say, I want to hear no more of the paper. But really, I mean, I won't go into them. I have them here in the paper, but I won't read them. in any case, they are not very important, just some minor defects of scansion. A fundamental question that Tolkien seeks to answer in the lecture on the tradition of versification is, what can tradition preserve? Poetic tradition, of course, he means, and what can it not? In addition to meter, understood as an abstract artistic pattern independent of language, poetic tradition can preserve elements of diction, Tolkien said. As he puts it, there always was a tendency or a desire in northern antiquity to differentiate the language of verse from that of daily speech. The preservation in poetry of specialized diction that does not occur in everyday speech can naturally lead to the fossilization of certain words. The point is illustrated by reference to Beowulf 9:24. Medesti gemat, maitha hose. Modern scholars can, with the assistance of comparative Germanic philology, confidently conclude that hose, a hapax legomenon, means company or troop, compare Gothic and Old High German Hansa. But the word is likely to have caused difficulties to the native learner of Old English, verse, who might have, as a result, felt reluctant to use it freely outside similar syntactic contexts. What tradition, according to Tolkien, cannot preserve, even in fossilized form, is archaic pronunciation or bygone sounds. This allows Tolkien to set a terminus antequem for the composition of Beowulf, the contraction of words like Theoan, from earlier Theohan, into monosyllabic Theon. The reasoning here is that verses like Man ye Theon, in which the uncontracted form must be assumed for the verse to scan, are common in Beowulf but are said to be absent from poems not to have been composed after contraction took place. So the idea here is that you need the older form in Beowulf, and so the poem must have been composed before the older form disappeared completely from the language, because archaic pronunciation cannot be retained exclusively in poetic tradition. That's Tolkien's view, and that is how he sets the terminus antequem for Beowulf, which is a very contested issue in Old English scholarship. Some other ideas by Tolkien. Alliterative practice shows front and back varieties of G to have been equivalent in much Old English verse. After back G became a plosive or stop word initially, however, the two varieties ceased to be alliteratively analogous. In the Battle of Maldon, for example, Yundom does not alliterate with Godwine, Godwi, and Gude, as they would have alliterated in Beowulf. Confronted then with Beowulf line 1, We Gardena, in Yardagum, across a 10th century Anglo-Saxon, would have probably carried the plosive articulation of Gar across the line, pronouncing Yar instead of Gar. Gar instead of Yar. This would have sounded quite artificial, Tolkien believed, and had nothing to do with genuine poetic practice, which is reflective of contemporary phonetics, not, he said, an impossible tradition of lot sounds. So I don't know if you will agree with this notion of Tolkien, but he believed that a late Anglo-Saxon would have pronounced Gardena in Gardagon, just to make it alliterate in the late period. The Battle of Maldon is in the freer or looser style, not originally intended as a written composition, but that does not mean that it is an extemporized poem, Tolkien thought. It is too long, he said, and it obviously does not consist of a string of stock phrases. Presumably the poet, like Cynewulf and Egil Skallagrimsson, spent several sleepless nights working on its composition before delivering it. So Tolkien is here quite imaginative. He imagines the Maldon poet working at night without sleeping. The poem was then transmitted by word of mouth before being put down to writing by chance. This process of oral repetition, Tolkien hypothesized, gave rise to a number of imperfections of a kind different from the scribal errors of a poem like Beowulf, conceived from the beginning by its author as a written work. So this is a notion that I find very, very interesting in Tolkien's essay. and very explanatory as well, that some of the errors that we see in Moldon are of a different kind than the ones we see in Beowulf, because they are errors of repetition or errors of performance, a kind of error not found in a purely written composition like Beowulf. So these imperfections, along with errors of a typically scribal nature, which the text of the poem also contains, and metrically interesting verses, are dealt with by Tolkien in Appendix 2, and they are grouped into several categories, but I won't go into that. It is noteworthy that line 271, Abre en bestunde, Geseal de Sumewunde, is the one similar to the one we find in Lagamon, seems to be seen as authentic by Tolkien in his notes on the poem, but then is regarded as non-authorial in the essay on versification, so he seems to have changed his mind. In particular, he sees it as a non-authorial interpolation from a style more similar to that of the Gied passages of the chronicle poems, such as the death of Alfred. This latter interpretation receives support, I believe, from the fact that a very similar line occurs in Lagamon's Brut, and Everstunde felleth hine to the Grunde, and that the style of the Brut has often been associated with that of chronicle verse. I have left for the end discussion of Appendix 1, Old English prosody, because therein Tolkien makes 2 points that have an important bearing on contemporary metrical scholarship. The first is about the reliability of Edward Sievers's theory of Old English meter. This is what Tolkien said. The proof of the pudding is not only in the eating, but in the making, or at any rate, reproduction. So the pudding here is the poetry, and the recipe of the pudding is meter, or metrical rules. Only a correct recipe, though it may be expressed in words and in manner quite different from those of the original cook or poet, and perhaps unintelligible to him, will produce the same pudding. And that notion of unintelligibility is very important, as I'll explain. So only using a recipe founded on Sievers's analysis, with modifications perhaps, but not fundamental alteration, can Old English verse be written. By which I mean, can anyone who knows the Old English verse language write new matter in it, which is not only a string of half-lengths actually found in our records, this can be done without any metrical knowledge or theory at all, and which does not only contain some lines of a pattern actually found, but also contains no lines which are not found. So in other words, in order to account for the poetry as we have it, we need the rules formulated by Edward Sievers in the 19th century. The second quote by Tolkien is about the functionality of alliteration, a point that he makes when discussing the interdependence of syllable length, stress, and alliteration in the poetry. And you can imagine Tolkien now pronouncing the quote. These were not isolated, but indissolubly connected. Stress and length were only considered together, and alliteration was infused in connection with both, sometimes dictated by them, sometimes coloring the words, and determining, as it were, the rhythm in doubtful cases. This function of alliteration is most important and is frequently overlooked by critics who perceive the interconnections of our artificially isolated types. But as a matter of fact, enormous numbers of Old English half-verses are susceptible of various analyses if the alliteration is unknown, where the full line is set out, and the alliteration known. Only in rare cases is there any doubt, except purely as to nomenclature. So alliteration was not an ornament. Alliteration played a key function in poetry, disambiguating function. And now we're going to see why these 2 quotes are important, or turned out to be very important for recent scholarship. 20 years ago, Thomas Bredehoft, in 2004 and then 2005, argued that Sievers's theory of meter was too complicated to reflect the poet's actual practice, and put forward a simplified version of it that was purportedly truer to historical reality. 3 years after that, Nikolai Yakovlev, in his Oxford DPhil dissertation, proposed a new theory of Old English meter, according to which alliteration is an ornamental, non-functional property of the verse. By eloquently asserting the empirical sufficiency and reliability and necessity of Sieversian metrics, and the rhythmically discriminating role played by alliteration within the system of versification, Tolkien made a very valuable contribution to a scholarly debate about Old English prosody several decades before it took place. It is not inconceivable that, given Tolkien's well-known authority on philological matters, the debate would have proceeded along very different lines, or maybe never have occurred, if his views had been published earlier. Thank you very much.